Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. For those that don't know me, my name is Mark Hans, and I'm a family law partner at Owen Mitchell. Now, you may have thought after Bonfire Night in Diwali that all the fireworks had gone out until the new year, but I can safely tell you that I've got a firecracker of a lineup for you today. And I'm going to speak and introduce you to these brilliant speakers that we have here today, who are going to talk to us about common issues that arise in the Jewish and the Asian communities. I'll introduce them shortly, as I think it's incredibly important for us all, more than ever really, to understand and grasp how cultural and other issues, not necessarily obvious, play a part when relationships break down in the context of different communities. The legal issues that arise in family law are very complex, and it is almost impossible to navigate these difficult issues without having a real understanding of the cultural issues that are at play. Obviously at Owen Mitchell, we're fortunate to have a full team of specialisms in these areas, and we can support our clients facing potential difficulties, both from a practical and a legal perspective. So today, whether you are a family lawyer hoping to broaden your understanding of these issues, or perhaps you've been touched, whether through friends, family, colleagues, by some of the issues we will speak about, I hope this short webinar will provide you with some fascinating insight into how we might deal with such complex issues. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our lineup of speakers. And first, Rami Smith, who's a graduate of Yeshivat Maharat, the first Jewish Orthodox school ordaining women as clergy. Rami was the first ordained Orthodox woman living in the UK, where there is currently one more and two in training. Rami has specialised training in Jewish law and pastoral care, and has spent years at the intersection of Jewish law and women's experience within it. She has taught in synagogues, secondary schools, universities and communities across the United States and England, and I believe she's almost just delayed her flight to be on this webinar today. In 2020, Rami, along with her co-founder, founded Get Out UK. This is an organisation that supports people struggling to receive their Jewish religious divorces. In its first year, the organisation has closed almost 11 difficult cases. Get Out UK was part of the team that wrote the guidance to the recent domestic abuse bill, giving rise to the notion that the unreasonable refusal to grant a Jewish divorce is domestic abuse, thus opening the door to help many vulnerable people who have had no protection under Jewish law. Rami, I hope that is a fair and accurate reflection of your bio. Would you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Rami, before I go to the other speakers?
Sure, thank you for that. I've been in the UK for about 3 years, and because what I do as far as my training in religious communities is so new, it hadn't really been done in this country before. So I knew that if I wanted to do this work, I would kind of have to create something for myself, since religious institutions weren't quite ready to hire me. And my co-founder, Rivka Mayer, she had been waiting for her religious divorce. She had been struggling to receive it from an abusive ex for 9.5 years. And she works locally in the Orthodox community, and she owns a wig salon, and she does my wigs. And so one day I was sitting there and I said, "Who's supporting you? Is there an organization? Are there people, rabbis and synagogues?" She said no. And literally in that moment, we just created Get Out UK. Yesterday, we closed our 11th case, a woman who's been waiting 25 years for her religious divorce. So yesterday was an exciting day, and I'm excited to keep the momentum going this morning with you.
Fantastic, thank you, Rami. And 9.5 years, wow, that's phenomenal. So coming on to our next speaker, Aruna Bansal. Now, Aruna has an impressive resume. In 2011, she was inspired to set up the Asian Single Parents Network, which is a registered community interest company, I believe. The aspirations of the network, as far as I understand it, Aruna, was to get Asian single parents and their kids interacting with each other for firm support and friendship, and to enhance their lives in the process. Can you tell us a little bit, Aruna, about your role in setting up that community interest and what you bring to that project? You're on mute, right? You're on mute, Aruna.
Okay. Yes, I set it up in 2011 because there wasn't anything else around at the time, specifically for Asians. And because when I went through it, there wasn't anybody else really to talk to who understood what I was going through, especially from the Asian background. I decided to set up the community interest company, just to have company when doing things with me and my daughter. So we're the only support network that supports both mums and dads in the South Asian community across the UK. And we're growing quickly. We're mainly London South East, also have members in the Midlands and as far up as the north in Leeds and Manchester. And we celebrated our 10-year anniversary in September.
Wonderful, thank you. And then we have our very own Aisha Chowdhury. Aisha is a family law specialist who I've had the privilege to work alongside. She is an absolute expert in all matters, all family law matters actually, but particular expertise in Sharia law, Islamic rulings and issues that arise in the context of relationship breakdown in Asian communities. Her and I share a passion for this. And we're often talking about things that other people may not find so interesting, but we really do. Aisha can speak multiple languages, including Urdu, Punjabi and Hindi. I'm sure there are more, Aisha. Aisha was also a finalist for the Welsh Women's Award in 2020, and I know firsthand the dedication she puts into each and every client. Aisha, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself to the audience?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Mark. So, as Mark said, I specialise in all things family law related. I'm an associate at Irwin Mitchell. I work with Mark, as he said, and we have these conversations all the time where we're talking about cultural aspects related to divorce and Sharia elements to a divorce as well. So, yeah, I really enjoy what I do. It's quite a niche area, so we don't have many lawyers in England and Wales who specialise in this area, but I think there is now a need to have these sorts of conversations and look at the cultural and the religious aspects of divorce, because so many people need that sort of advice. So yeah, really good to be on this panel today and discuss these sorts of issues.
Fantastic. Now, the audience will be pleased to know that I decided against death by PowerPoint on today's show. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to challenge the panel and try and draw upon their experiences and ask them a number of questions. They don't, and this is not scripted, they don't know exactly what I'm going to ask them. So I thought that'd be make it a bit more fluid. So I'm going to go to you, Aisha, first. Aisha, sorry. And we've spoken at length on numerous occasions, you and I have, about the impact of Sharia law. And you know my views about its unfairness, especially in the English court's treatment of it, especially in the context of the Akhtar decision, which sadly the Court of Appeal, in my opinion, missed the opportunity to bridge a gap in the law. But can you tell us, please, Aisha, more than ever now, I think it's important, what's the significance of Sharia law in the UK? And is divorce more accepted in the Muslim communities? And how is it treated?
I think, you know, I agree with you, Mark, with what you've said. I think that was a missed opportunity for the court, but Sharia law is, I think, even more relevant now. We have a growing Muslim population, and that growing Muslim population is considering their religion and their culture when making really important decisions. Whether that be to do with when they get married, when they're separating, how they bring up their children, when it comes to their financial affairs. So Muslims, you know, and the growing number of Muslims in the UK, they really consider their religion and their culture when they make these big decisions. So I think Sharia law now is even more relevant, and I agree with you, that was a missed opportunity as far as the court is concerned, but that's why it's so important for us to have these conversations and to raise awareness as far as religion and culture is concerned with our clients, and so that we can provide that service to them where we know basically what things are going through their minds when they're making these important decisions. So yeah, I do think there is a need to have these sorts of conversations now. Sharia law is not the law of the land, obviously. It's not the first port of call. We're not governed by Sharia law in any way, obviously. It's a religious law, but it is very important when advising Muslim clients. I think in terms of divorce now, it's always been frowned upon in the Muslim community and considered a last resort. But there are clear procedures in place for men and women to allow them to come out of unhappy or abusive marriages with Islamic guidance. And I think from a cultural perspective, times have definitely moved on in terms of how divorce is perceived in the Muslim community. And more people are getting divorced, and that's probably because people, especially women, are financially independent now, and they're not generally willing to put up with a bad relationship. But that can also be said for divorce outside the Muslim community. So there is a real significance of Sharia law in the UK because of the growing Muslim community and population, and there is that move away from divorce being perceived as something that's frowned upon or a taboo subject. There is a move, but it hasn't been significant enough, and there's a lot more work to be done, I'd say.
Thank you, Aisha. And just for those non-family lawyers amongst us, the Akhtar decision involved a husband and wife who had been in an Islamic marriage for many, many years and had regarded one another as husband and wife. And what happened is that first instance decision decided that that actually could be recognised as some form of void marriage. And therefore, that opened the gateway for Mrs. Akhtar, the wife in that case, to make financial claims. And unfortunately, the Court of Appeal closed the door on that and said, actually, it's a non-qualifying ceremony. And therefore, if it's a non-qualifying ceremony, that there are no financial remedies other than those available in property law and for the benefit of the children. So I know a lot of lawyers amongst us will know that, but that's what Aisha and I are referring to. But thank you very much for that, Aisha. Aruna, I think I'd like to explore with you something, if I may, just following on really from those cultural issues. Now, I've dealt with an uncountable number of divorces and family law issues in the context of South Asian communities, Aruna, and I know that's where your heart lies as well. Now, in my experience, there are a lot of common themes and threads that arise over those issues. For example, I've always found that having some kind of understanding of the initial cultural aspects, for example, how a wife might marry and then go and live initially with their in-laws, that's quite common and common theme. Could you explain a bit about your network and why it's important for ethnic minorities in that context?
Yes, because of the stigma, I think, as Aisha said, it's frowned upon in the Asian community, divorce. It's a last resort. So the stigma in this community is quite apparent. It is changing very slowly, but it's going to take time for that to happen. So ASPN provides a space where members can talk to others who understand what they're going through, and they're not judged really. So they're surrounded by other people who understand what they're going through, who won't judge them. And that's really important. They feel relieved when they join the network that finally, they're surrounded by people who understand what they're going through, because they quite often can't talk to their own family or relatives or friends about what they're going through. So it's really important that they get that space, with other people who understand.
That's incredible, and that's really powerful stuff, Aruna. And I think that the message there is that people will feel empowered and able to move on, in what is a very difficult situation for them, but you provide that opportunity and space for them to grow, and I think it's absolutely incredible. So thank you. Rami, I'd like to come to you if that's okay. I'm just going to simply ask you an outright question, okay, if I may, about the significance of Jewish customs and religions on divorce in England and Wales, and is it more acceptable for divorce to take place in the Jewish community? Mute, Rami, sorry.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Rami.
Okay, great. According to Jewish law, divorce is a completely acceptable action. And the way that the Jewish law was kind of crafted around divorce is actually to protect women. Though as times have changed, it doesn't really seem like this process protects women as much as it was meant to. There's a huge significance to divorce in the Jewish community. And I want to just share a few of those ways shortly. First of all, Judaism is a religion that's completely centered around family. Every holiday, ritual, the communal structure, prayer, meals, education, all of these things revolve around family in our communities. The dismantling of a nuclear family structure means that these areas are going to be impacted. So it's not just disorienting because one's family life changes, but they're actually possibly practicing differently, but they're seen to be different within the community. It's the normality and kind of the day-to-day life that is going to change as well. Second of all, Orthodox Jews, especially, not so much secular Jews, they tend to be skeptical of taking matters to secular courts. So it's not really as much skepticism as it's viewed in the community as not allowed unless a religious court has told you that you are allowed to go. Anyone who's modern Orthodox, which is a relatively small number in this country, they'll likely go to a secular court with no worries, and certainly someone who's a secular Jew will come with no worries, but someone who's from the ultra-Orthodox community will probably try to settle things in-house before coming to a secular lawyer. That means that divorces are often handled, at least in the beginning, if not throughout, by people who are not trained. They're not trained in the law, and they're not trained in any sort of emotional or pastoral support. And we've found that these people very often don't know when to stay in their lane, which is important for lawyers to know. And the last thing is that even though divorce is pretty common in the Orthodox and the Jewish communities, those who seek counsel from religious leaders and from prominent figures in the community are often told to stay, even though according to the law, one is allowed to leave their marriage. Certainly, if the marriage is rife with abuse or any other issue, but religious leaders will often try to convince someone to stay in their marriage for the sake of their children, even if there is abuse or something else going on. Addiction, infidelity, we see so many cases where people have been made to stay, especially women, in their marriages when that clearly is not the right move. So by the time someone comes to a lawyer, they're probably carrying a lot of baggage with them from their communities around the areas of ritual practice, the place in the community, and probably the feeling of failing a religious leader who's tried to convince them to stay. So when they finally come to a secular lawyer or a secular court, they're kind of carrying communal baggage along with them. Even though the law is actually very accepting and supportive specifically of women throughout this process, the way it plays out, we see is not really reflective of that anymore.
Thanks, Rami. I mean, you touched upon the abuse part there, and I know this is part of something that which you feel very passionately about. But you know, from a lawyer's perspective, we often have to be alive to those issues because, you know, seeking, I would say, probably as a matter of course, if you're acting for a client from the Jewish community, seeking and undertaking a promise from the husband that he will obtain a get. Or it seems to me a crucial kind of mandatory step that needs to be taken. And there was a case actually of Moher where I was so pleased that the court stepped in really and said you will carry on paying maintenance to your wife until you until you obtain the get, until you actually take that step. And so it's abuse, isn't it? It's abuse, Rami.
Yeah, people don't really understand unless they're part of the community that some things that seem really subtle are actually within the community quite explicitly signs of abuse. The Mower case is actually a case that we are working on. And cases like that where someone will say, I'm happy to give the get, I promise I'll give you your religious divorce if you give me full rights to the house, if you give, you know, more custody. And we see that all the time where people say, I'm not refusing the get, I'm just going to give it under these conditions. And there are so many kind of like ingrained gender and power dynamics that go along with this. When there's a judge from a religious court who validates that kind of abuse, it's not the same as if a secular judge had said, it's, you know, you must compromise. It comes with a lot of religious and emotional baggage as well. Absolutely.
Aisha, jewellery. I want to talk to you about jewellery, if I may. Now, this is a fascinating topic and very, very, very relevant in my experience of dealing with many family law issues. We obviously some of the items are so sentimental, you know, they've been passed down the generations from family member to family member, and the issue can be a source of a lot of debate, understandably, a lot of heat. What's in your experience in this area with your specialisms? What role does jewellery play, and how does that interplay with the mayor?
Yeah, so gold jewellery, as Mark said, is such a big point of dispute when looking at Muslim clients that are separating, and there is that emotional aspect to it, and people generally take the view when there's been gold gifted at a Muslim ceremony that it should be returned. And Mark knows this, you know, we deal with these disputes all the time, and you know, wife might say, well, actually it's my gold now because I was gifted it at the ceremony, and the husband will say, well, actually no, it was just for you from my family and now I need to have it back. So we have those arguments, and believe it or not, lots of correspondence back and forth between solicitors over that issue, and you know, we're trying to deal with evidence, photographs of who had the gold and where's the gold now and what's going on. But from a Sharia law perspective, it's quite clear what happens with the gold. So if with the Muslim ceremony, when you have gold jewelry that is being gifted between the families, whether it's from husband to the wife directly or from the husband's family to the wife at the ceremony. And I'll just say the reason I'm not mentioning the husband having any gold gifted is because in Islam, men are not supposed to wear gold, so they're not permitted to wear gold. So it's usually a gift that the woman receives at a wedding ceremony, either from husband or his family. So when that's happening, it's very clear what would happen to that gold, or what should happen to that gold if there is a marital breakdown. And the important point is that you deal with that point when the marriage is taking place. So you have to declare what that gold is intended for. So if the gold is intended for use during the marriage only, then that needs to be said by the groom or his family. That needs to be made out clearly to the wife that this is your gold, but only during the course of the marriage, and after that I'll have it back, you know, if there's a marital breakdown. If it's intended as a gift, and it's customary, and we all understand this in the community, that usually it's just gold being gifted to the wife and she gets to keep it, and later yet there is a dispute about it. But if it wasn't said at the time of the marriage that this gold is only intended during the course of the marriage, and it reverts back to the husband or his family afterwards, then wife does tend to keep it. If there is still a dispute and nothing was declared at the time of the marriage about what this gold is for, then you look at the parties' customary sort of practices and what they tend to do. So with a Pakistani family, for example, they won't say, well, this gold is just for the use during the marriage. It tends to be the case that the wife receives this gold as a gift and she thinks it's hers and she keeps it, whether the parties remained married or not. So it is a point of dispute, which is what, you know, it ties back into the point of the meher. And meher is something, it's consideration given at the time of the Islamic marriage, and people usually have a written Islamic contract. Lots of people have verbal contracts, but that's another issue. But at the time of the Islamic ceremony, the Islamic marriage, you should have a written Islamic marriage contract called a nikah, and like any other contract, consideration should be given for that contract. And what we have in the Islamic community is talk of meher, which is monetary, or it can be gold. It could be items basically intended to be consideration for that contract. So when that contract is being drawn up, when that nikah is being drawn up, that's when you mention things like gold and what would happen to it if there is a divorce. You also talk about what the consideration is that's being paid essentially for this nikah to take place, and it can either be payment on the day of the nikah, so it could be a couple of £100 assessed on the husband's means and his financial circumstances, or it could be thousands of pounds. And there's a dispute currently in the court about an oral promise to pay a meher, and it's in the thousands. And it really is important to get advice when you're thinking about entering into an Islamic marriage about things like meher. What should it be? Should you write it into an Islamic contract? When is it going to be paid? Is it going to be paid on the day of the Islamic ceremony, or is it going to be paid on the point of a divorce, or at some point in the future? And what's happening with the gold? So these are things that need to be considered. And I always say, it's not, you don't go to a family lawyer really when things go wrong. You should really, we're family lawyers, aren't we? So you should come to us when you're thinking about how to deal with your family circumstances, including a marriage. And with a Muslim client, especially women, I'd say, and even men, if they're gifting a lot of monies or they're giving a substantial amount in a meher, it's really important to get that advice at the beginning and make sure this nikah contract is solid and it includes everything that you'd want it to include.
Brilliant. Well, no, that's really, really fascinating, Aisha. And yes, I mean, we've dealt with a number of jewellery disputes, as you know, and often actually credibility comes into play, and, jewellery may be placed with other family members, and then that existence of that is then denied. I've got a few stories about how we've managed to uncover that in the past, but it really is about looking at the evidence and maybe bringing in extended family members as well. And that really just leads me on really to you, Aruna, if I can come to you, please, about the extended families and whether there are any additional issues that, other than that one which was just identified, with extended families when working with the Safe Asian community.
Yes, it's certainly more complicated when it comes to Asian families, because it isn't just between the couple, the marriage, it's also with the extended family. So, for instance, Asian couples are often assisted with the purchase of a property by their parents, or they're involved in the family business. So if legal arrangements aren't in place to safeguard the assets, then it becomes very messy later on. So family members are embroiled in the legal proceedings. So, for instance, with my own marriage ending, my ex's family were involved because they had shares in his property as well, or he transferred property to them when it came to the end of the marriage. So it all becomes very complex, really, because other members are involved.
Absolutely. And then there's discussions about, obviously, there are cultural aspects in my experience where money can pass quite fluidly through the family and the generations, and trying to establish who's the ownership. And sometimes it's genuine, sometimes it's being used as a disguise to defeat proper financial claims, and really not just financially, but also to cause you emotional hardship as well. And it's all part of the bigger coercive package in my experience, Aruna. So I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Definitely. I mean, as I say, property was passed to my in-laws, sort of at the end of our marriage, just before, so it could be seen as control in a way.
Absolutely. No, it really is. I mean, I mentioned at the start of this webinar, and I think, Rami, I'm going to come to you next, if that's okay, but following on really from this theme, I mentioned at the start of the webinar, and I can't really emphasize this enough, but a practitioner's understanding of the cultural and religious issues, in my opinion, is absolutely essential to providing the client with a journey in which they feel understood and supported, because that's part of our role as well. So I'm very keen to draw upon your experience, Rami, everything you've said today, and it really struck me. And what I would like for the legal practitioners amongst us is, what do you think we need to be aware of when dealing with Jewish clients? What would be very useful to us to be aware of, and useful for us to know, so that we can provide our client with the best possible journey?
So divorce, like most areas of Jewish law, it's an area that's completely controlled by men. a man has to grant his wife the divorce. That's the Jewish law. The Beth Din, the Beit Din, the religious court, is made up of all men. Very often, a woman won't talk to a woman throughout the process at all. Even if she is called into the religious court for her divorce, she'll very often be sitting alone in front of 7 or 8 men who either are part of her community, so there's an established gender dynamic, or it's a secular woman who's not used to that gender dynamic, but all of a sudden is placed before 7 or 8 very powerful men. And we see gender dynamics bubbling up a lot in these conversations. And when it is a woman struggling through this, which it almost always is, we have male clients who struggle with their get as well. Though a man has to give the get, a woman has to accept it. So we have seen cases where a man tries to give it. We have a client who's been begging his wife to accept her divorce for 18 months, and she simply won't do it because she wants a different financial arrangement. And she, like when we see it with men, says, "I'm happy to accept it, but I need our property to be split differently." So there's a lot of gender dynamics there as well. It's also not uncommon to come across people who have tried to settle this, like I said before, internally beforehand. Beforehand meaning before they've come to you to a secular lawyer. This can involve anything from mediation, sometimes with a proper mediator, sometimes almost always with a community member or a rabbi who tries to pass as a mediator and doesn't have formal training. It can involve payoffs. It could involve hiding abuse. We have a case of a woman who suffered horrific abuse from her ex-husband, and in the process of the religious court helping them move forward, the religious court actually got him a job in a care home. And so we see abuse being swept under the rug quite a bit. Pressure to settle with unfair custody arrangements, especially when there's abuse involved. As an organization, we try to call this out as much as possible, and one of our goals is to help these religious courts realize that if there are eyes on them, they won't be able to sweep abuse under the rug. These people who are working within the community, very often their hearts are in the right place. They really do want to help the couple move forward. But where we've come to expect transparency in almost every area of our lives, this is one area where there is almost no transparency, and there's a lot of shady things that happen. And like we just discussed, very often people will be, especially in the more ultra-Orthodox communities, people will be accompanied by a family member. If it is a young woman who's getting divorced from an ultra-Orthodox community, we see that it's not uncommon for her father or her brother to accompany her and to be the one doing the majority of the talking. We have found that making meetings without them is the most effective way to find out what our client actually wants, but it takes a little bit of time to build trust in order to get the woman to come or to bring a woman from her life. But what the family is saying that if she wants or is in her best interest is not always, often not what she actually wants or what is in her best interest. But because there's this skepticism and fear of the outside world, especially young women are very often not allowed to or able to go to their lawyer by themselves. So as their lawyer, it is very helpful to know that you probably will have family. They've probably gone to other people before they've come to you, and actually getting the client alone and building some trust is going to go a very long way in figuring out what their needs really are.
It's incredible, really, Rami. There's such a gender imbalance there, but I think the top tip of the day must be that the woman has to accept the get. And actually, I've never looked at it from that angle before, because we're so fixated on ensuring that the husband does what he should do. So I think that's a top tip, and thank you. I mean, you're giving these people a voice, and I think that's incredible, really. So thank you for that insight. I've certainly taken away some tips myself there. I've written them down. I just want to switch over to Aisha, if I can. Now, one of the first questions I ask is whether this was a love or an arranged marriage, and as time has passed, it's become more and more love. When I first started out, it was more and more arranged. I don't know if Aruna might have a comment on that shortly, but Aisha, Can you tell me, please, what I wanted to ask you was, are arranged forced marriages still an issue, or have times moved on? And the reason I ask that is because I think we have to be very careful to draw a distinction between arranged and forced marriages, because they're two different things. And a forced marriage really does, in my opinion, expose some of the most vulnerable in the community, and tragically can lead to loss of life. And we've done a lot of work around that. So can you tell me, really, is this still an issue?
Yeah, so with love marriages, if anyone doesn't know what that is, it's usually a term used in the Asian community, and it's when you actually like each other before you get married, and you may have had a period of dating or courting before the marriage ceremony itself. So you really know each other and you're in love. That's why it's called a love marriage, and you want to get married to each other. That in itself can sometimes carry a lot of issues if you're from different backgrounds, or if you're from a different caste system. There's lots of issues that go with that. But yeah, that's what a love marriage is. But I do think, Mark, that it's still an issue. I think arranged marriages and forced marriages are still an issue. But like you said, I think times have significantly moved on, so that people are now even having interfaith marriages, love marriages, and I think a lot needs to be done again in this area. But I think because we have a new generation now, that generation is more liberal thinking, and they are moving towards and away from arranged marriages and forced marriages, and they're moving towards accepting love marriages and interfaith marriages. Like you said, I think honor-based abuse was very common between boys and girls for what seemed like really trivial transgression, and this was probably more prominent 20-30 years ago, and we all read about things like this in the papers, and when people were discussing things, and it led to really sad things like kidnappings, forced marriages, and domestic violence as well. So honor-based abuse, I think, probably was more prominent 20-30 years ago. We are moving away from the arranged marriage situation, and like you said, it's very different to a forced marriage. Arranged marriage is just when the elders and the family have a bit of a say in who you're marrying, and they suggest people to you, and may show you some photos and set up some chats or informal chats with the family and things like that. So we are moving away from arranged marriages and moving more towards men and women just being able to find who they want to marry, have a period of dating or courting, and then people and the parents being more accepting of that. Yeah, so I think a lot still needs to be done, but times are slowly moving on.
No, absolutely. And it's picking up on what you said about interfaith relationships there, Aisha and Aruna. I mean, do you see that? How do interfaith relationships and marriages have an impact on single parents, would be my natural question to you, arising from what Aisha's mentioned there.
We have some from interfaith relationships, but not that many, from my experience of our network. So the majority, I would say, have married within their own caste, not necessarily caste, but religion. But I think the problems aren't too dissimilar between same-faith marriages and interfaith. There are cultural differences sometimes that can play a part in the breakdown of a marriage, especially within the constraints of extended families. But we don't have a great deal of experience, unfortunately, in interfaith.
Well, no, I mean, that's my experience as well, Aruna, and but I think there are still some very hard cultural lines, aren't there, in these relationships, and in many ways, it's not a bad thing necessarily all of the time. Many of these things are very positive things. It's when they're kind of skewed out of context or used as a way of control. But Rami, I'm sorry, I jumped off from you earlier because I jumped onto the topic of the South Asian communities. I just picked up earlier, you mentioned something earlier, and I wanted to come back to it if I can, about the domestic abuse bill.
Yeah.
Our legislation arises predominantly from 1973. I won't bore you to death with the history of it all. What's your kind of involvement with the domestic abuse bill? I think that's quite a fascinating piece. Can you just give us a brief kind of overview as to what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, so Because our organization was pretty recently founded, we got brought onto a team that already existed. It's a team of members of parliament, some lords, some baronesses, and it's a wonderful team, mostly made up of Jewish people, some secular, some Orthodox, and they were looking to continue through the domestic abuse bill, further protection for mostly women. We usually talk about women, though there are a few men who are involved in this well, and some of them are our clients. But so when we talk about this, we are mostly talking about women. But one of the issues that we've seen a lot is that the law, even though a judge might push off a final divorce until a get is given, many people in the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities don't have a secular marriage. They only have a religious marriage. So a law that was put into place to protect people, to protect women, wasn't actually helping as many as it could have helped, because you have to be civilly married to be protected during your civil divorce. So because the domestic abuse bill was going through, it became very important that we kind of helped the courts and the law understands that the refusal to grant a get, which is a Jewish divorce, the refusal to grant a get is domestic abuse. The control that a man still has over his wife, and it is bizarre that we call her still his wife. And as I said yesterday, we just closed a 25-year-old case, and this woman was sitting in front of the judge and the religious judge, and he kept saying, "Your husband, your husband." And this man got remarried 23 years ago, has 2 new children from his new marriage, but according to the Jewish law, he was still her husband. And so it's very hard for people to understand that outside of our communities, and they're actually not Orthodox Jews at all. She is completely secular, but because of the importance of a religious marriage, a religious divorce was just as important to her. So while he was able to remarry outside of that, she knew that she personally felt she could never remarry, even though according to secular law she could, because religious divorce wouldn't allow her to do that. So I think it takes some internal knowledge of the community and the religion and the dynamics to understand just how much of a grip a man can have over a woman over the religious marriage. What we offered as an organization was largely case studies. We started off in our first week, we had 6 clients, and by the end of our first month, we had 23. So we kind of jumped in really quickly and got a lot of information very fast, and it happened to be at the same time that the guidance was being written. So we drew up a lot of case studies, and also because we operate in kind of every camp, but also no camp, we were able to facilitate a lot of really wonderful conversations between the religious courts and the members of parliament who it seemed were having some trouble communicating with each other. The religious courts were very unhappy about this guidance. They do not like that they were not consulted beforehand, but mostly a man has to give a get this divorce according to his own free will, and they believed that the threat of prosecution took away free will. So they were actually not granting a divorce that was being given if a man was threatened with prosecution. And we've seen that happen with a few clients, that because they were threatening prosecution after many years of the religious courts seemingly doing nothing, all of a sudden the religious courts were getting very upset that they weren't involved in the process and they didn't like how the divorce was happening. So even if a man was coming to give the divorce, the religious courts weren't accepting that divorce. So we kind of facilitated some of those conversations as well.
That's really incredible stuff, Rami. I mean, I remember acting for very recently, actually acting for a Jewish wife, but she, and there was no suggestion of any form of necessarily control, but there was very much a figurehead for the family, and that figurehead was respected. And actually, she was in our first meeting, and she said to me, "I think I'm a beneficiary of a trust." And I said, "Could you guess what it's worth?" And she said, "I don't know, £500,000. I don't know, something like that." It turned out that as she had to go through the process and disclose that actually the trust was worth many millions, and she had no clue. and the trust deed, she had not a clue. It's quite actually interesting arguing to the other side that my client did not have any idea what her wealth was, and she genuinely never. And interestingly, in the trust deed, she would only benefit from the trust if she married inside the Jewish faith. So if she went outside of the Jewish faith, she would forgo those that money. And actually, that was quite incredible actually to read that, and nobody seemed to think it was an issue at all. So just hearing about the gender imbalance that you spoke about is quite fascinating really, and does kind of chime with my experience of dealing with Jewish families. I'm going to challenge all three of you. You'll be pleased to know that I've only got a couple of questions left to ask you. But I'm going to challenge you, all three of you, if I may, and draw upon your experience and share with the audience things about relating to children. So we've spoken about divorce, we've spoken about Mehr, the get, we've spoken about in the context of single parents, cultural issues, financial issues, but often the most important thing are the children, obviously. Really, Aisha, if I could just come to you, really, what should we be thinking about when advising a client from the Muslim faith in matters relating to children? Is it the same? Have we got to think about anything different, or are we overcomplicating things?
No, I think we do need to think about Muslim children with other elements, the other elements to Muslim children really. And the main thing I'd say, and I don't think a lot of people know this, but Muslim clients are protective over their children like any other parent is protective over their children, but they are specifically quite protective over their daughters. And that's because generally, according to custom, women tend to get married and move away from their families, whether it's another city, another street, or another country. So generally what happens is daughters grow up, get married and move away and go and live with the husband's family or the husband. So it's really important to understand that, because a lot of the times you might have a client and they're talking about their daughter and you might think, well, actually, what's the difference? You know, it's whether it was a son or a daughter, it's the same thing. So they might be a bit more protective over their daughter, but then when it comes to their son, there might be a dispute over circumcision. And I've dealt with so many cases where this actually is a point of dispute, and you know, people have different views on that, but to understand how important something like that is for a Muslim client, you know, it can be, when you have interfaith marriages, that can be a point of dispute between two parties. You know, should the son be circumcised or not? So that's another thing to take into consideration and be live to, and depending on who you're advising, you'd need to look at that. And I also think understanding the special occasions, and our special occasions, I'd say Muslim client special occasions, is very important. So you'd have the main ones, which is Ramadan and the two Eids, and very helpfully they change every year. So you have to stay on top of it and make sure you know when the dates are. So with normal contact arrangements, you're looking at special occasions anyway, and you're looking at what the term time contact is and what the holiday arrangements are. But with Muslim clients, you will then have to deal with what should happen in Ramadan. You know, when parties are fasting, is there going to be different arrangements? What happens on special occasions like Eid? Eid is such a big thing for Muslim clients, and you have, you know, breakfast is so important on that day. The prayer in the morning is so important on that day. Who does the child go with for that? So there's lots of additional considerations, you know, when you're advising a client, a Muslim client, when it comes to their children. So don't treat it the same. Just look into these extra things as well.
Brilliant, thanks Aisha. Now we are we've got a strict time slot here today, so thank you all for those fascinating contributions. I'm going to now go to the we've had some questions come in, so can I just put these out to the panel, please? And if anybody has any questions at all, please let us know, and we'll try and answer them as quickly as we can. We've got 11 minutes remaining. One for you, Aisha. How have the English courts been dealing with Islamic marriage contracts? Is there a prenuptial analogy?
No, it's not a prenuptial analogy. Prenups are very different. So with an Islamic marriage, it's not a recognised marriage in the UK, in England and Wales at the moment, and that's what we were talking about at the beginning with the significance of the ACTA decision, and that's where we hope the court would intervene and set some good law in the area. But with prenuptial agreements, they're quite accepted, and it's part of the law in England and Wales. With Islamic marriages, when you're looking at having that ceremony, you have this nikah contract drawn up, and that's only applicable to the Islamic marriage. In the event of a dispute, when it comes to anything in that Islamic marriage, you're looking at breach of contract. So it's civil law territory, not family law territory, where you're looking at things like prenup. So that's where it crosses over, and you will then need to speak to a civil law specialist as well. So there's that hybrid element to it. So no, it's not the same as the prenup. It's quite different actually, and you go into that breach of contract territory.
Thank you very much, Raimi. One question for you from the panel, which from the audience is there anything particular we should take into account when advising a Jewish client about children matters?
Yeah, so like Aisha said, people might be more protective of their daughters just because girls tend to be a little bit more sheltered in their upbringing. Big things, also like Aisha said, Sabbath and holidays are very big in custody disputes because Orthodox Jews don't use electricity or any means of transportation on these holidays. It means that they very often have to be with one parent and can't share the holiday. Sometimes a parent, usually a father, will try to use Jewish law and customs in discussions of custody. They might say something like, the Torah says that a man has to teach his son X, or a man has to be with his son during Y. And we know that though the Torah says this, it's not actually true according to Jewish law. Mothers are also allowed to teach their children things the same way fathers are allowed to. The other thing is that sometimes children are seen as sort of a currency to normalcy, that the parent who has the children with them is able to participate in either rituals more normally or just show up to synagogue and be viewed as like anyone else in a way that someone who is divorced but doesn't have their children with them is not able to do that. And also just by the time that it's come to a lawyer, especially in the ultra-Orthodox community, there's been a lot of discussions already about custody, whether or not your client is sharing it with you. So sometimes a client is asked to give up custody in order to receive their get, their religious divorce, and they might not share that because they're embarrassed of it, or they might have been told that and they're rejecting it and coming to you. But certainly by the time they land in your office, they have been told things about their children, either over custody or about the divorce in a broader sense, that they should be not pursuing divorce for the sake of their children.
Brilliant, Raimi. I don't think we have any more questions from the audience at the moment, but if anybody does have any questions, I'm sure that our panel, even after the event, will be happy to answer those. So please just send them in if you feel you'd prefer to do that separately. I'm going to give each of you 30 to 45 seconds to tell me very quickly what are the key takeaway messages from our audience are from you. And I'm going to go to Aruna first.
Sorry, I think understanding the differences of Asian marriages will certainly help our parents feel understood. So that's really key to hold something like this today, to understand the difference in cultural issues. So that's one from me. I'm going to pass it on to somebody else now.
I'll go next then. I'd say when we're talking from a legal perspective, just very briefly, I'd say if you have a Muslim client, look at the nikah contract, talk to them about that. Look at any gifts from family members, because structures of families and money's being gifted is a massive thing. So talk to them about that and look at whether you need declaration of trust or anything like that being drawn up, maybe legal charges. But really coming back to basics, when you're starting off right at the beginning with a Muslim client, look at how to pronounce their name, ask them what they prefer to be called, because actually with Muslim names, if you shorten the name, you might completely change the meaning of that name, and it might be offensive because it's usually in Arabic. So look at the pronunciation of name, look at what they prefer to be called, don't shorten it without talking to them, and actually look at their family structures. Joint family systems are very normal with Muslim clients, so look at that and then gain an understanding of that. So that's my top tips.
Raimi, before I go on to you, we're very short on time, so I need a very quick answers, but the questions are coming in thick and fast. If we don't get around to you answering your questions, we will send you the responses separately. But Rami, a question for you. Very late in the day, are people taking out halakhic prenups? Who is drafting them? How binding are they?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to touch on prenups because I'm from America. In America, people draw up what's called a halachic prenup, which means a prenup that's connected to the Jewish law. It's actually not a Jewish legal document at all. It's a contract like any other contract. I was married in America, so I have one. But what this document says is, in the event where one party refuses to either give or accepts the divorce, they have to pay a specific amount of money every week or every month until the divorce is settled. And it's an incentive to get things settled very quickly so they don't drag on and abuse doesn't ensue. It is very complicated in this country. I'm new to this country, but I'm married to a barrister, so I feel like it kind of balances out a bit. This prenup does not exist in this country. There is a form of prenuptial agreement in the United Synagogue, which says if you are married within the United Synagogue, you need to be divorced within the United Synagogue, which at first felt a little bit insufficient to me, but now having seen people who hop around from religious court to religious court is actually somewhat helpful. Prenups are not a thing yet here. We're really working hard on it. If any of you can help us with the legal side, we're not lawyers. We would love that help.
Rami, and I can assume that if anybody wants to get in touch with you afterwards,
yes,
you have no issue with that.
Please, please.
Well, that draws the discussion to a close. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for that fascinating insight. If I can just impress upon the audience, please, there are some feedback forms, and I know it's very tedious to complete these, and I have to admit I don't always complete them, but I would like, if possible, if you could complete the feedback form, we would be tremendously grateful, because that really does help inform us as to whether this webinar has been useful to you and what we could do differently or better next time and what has worked well. So really, really grateful if you could complete those. But other than that, I wish you a very nice rest of your day, and thank you again to the panel for taking the time to speak with us, and Rami particularly, I wish you a safe flight.